Chapter 1. The desire for mutual recognition. The fundamental social desire of all human beings is the desire for mutual recognition. This desire is an unmediated movement of being outward toward the other, emanating directly from my very center that seeks to make contact with the being of the other. Thus, coming into contact is a singular movement that has two experiential poles: my desire to recognize and my desire for a reciprocating recognition. But you can't have one without the other. What is aspired to and what occurs when it occurs is an indissoluble co-presence. And this co-presence, made manifest through mutual recognition, is the realization of our social being, a social being that pre-exists our realization of it. If we are out of contact, we are actually in flight from that contact rather than truly disconnected. The inherent mutuality of our social being is always pulling us back toward each other. In every moment, the desire for the immediacy and co-presence of mutual recognition pulses through us, moves us out toward each other, and seeks to realize reciprocally and through the draw of a mutual magnetic pull our inherent social nature. Consider the color portrait of a woman by photographer Robert Bergman. In looking at this portrait in its full color presence, at first you might only see the face of a woman. Most likely you will start out looking at her from a distance, as one often looks at a portrait or really at any object in the world. And she might at first appear to you as sad or troubled or thoughtful, and perhaps also resilient in carrying life's burdens. Her freckles might stand out, or you might notice particularly the redness of her dress and hair against the red light behind her. But if you allow yourself to stay with her for a full 30 seconds and don't pull away or allow her image to simply glance off your gaze, you may suddenly encounter her directly as a fully present human being. At first, you may have this disturbing, disorienting encounter through her right eye as her gaze penetrates the shield of your normal distance as a withdrawn observer. But if you stay with her and don't avert your own gaze, you will see that you are experiencing her presence as a totality, and not only through the eye, as a radiant energy manifesting her living being as a whole social person. And at the same moment, as you are pulled into relation with her, you will feel your own presence that you did not feel an instant before. You were lost in thought, floating inside the withdrawn mental space of your head, and now you are for a moment, or for longer if you can tolerate it, fully present in relation to another human being. I have described this as disorienting and disturbing, and this is so because the photograph has the uncanny power to dissolve the withdrawnness and accompanying distance that we ourselves have learned to construct to protect us from a vulnerability to the other that, due to our conditioning, frightens us. We have all learned to fear this vulnerability to the other, just as in Freudian terms, the ego fears and defends itself against the impulses of the id. And what we fear is the loss of the mediating moat that we have learned to lay down in the interspace between ourselves and others, a moat that coexists with and is monitored by our moment-to-moment mental activity, the anxious monkey mind of thought. But while it is therefore disorienting and disturbing to have that moat suddenly erased as we encounter the woman in red, we also experience relief. She graciously and beautifully brings us back into contact with others, with the entire social world, and with ourselves as social beings. She reminds us of the potential that exists in the next moment. She gives us hope. She makes us want to change the world so that what we experience in encountering her can become real for our social lives and for social life as a whole. Right this moment, if you have been or are regarding the portrait, and if you have allowed yourself to encounter her, you will feel your heart beating faster. What makes Robert Bergman a great artist is not something unique or special that he has added to the portrait of this woman, but rather that he has revealed her as the true presence in the world that she actually is as she lives her existence from within her own experience. His portrait brings forth the person behind the outer appearance, the being who actually inhabits the eyes that we otherwise experience as ocular globes. Through his way of capturing her in a single moment, he is reminding us all of the presence that we actually are, and he is calling upon us to emerge from our isolation, to gain the confidence that we really are all here together, to release ourselves from the imprisonment of our separation and discover the beauty of our co-present collective humanity, not as a collection of individuals, but as an interconnected unity of differentiated social being. We have the same experience of discovery when we encounter newborn children, at least once they are old enough to make eye contact with us. Like the woman in red, the newborn child suddenly pulls us out of our distanced mental selves, surrounded by the moat, into the fullness of his or her presence. Not having learned to be wary of the other, or to develop stranger anxiety, to use the term through which psychology currently naturalizes as an inevitable stage the laying down of our alienation, the child makes us burst into a smile when we encounter him or her. Like the woman in red, the newborn child instantly relieves the suffering of our normal spiritual imprisonment and helps us to return momentarily to who we really are. This is why every newborn child brings us the possibility of salvation from the suffering of separation, from the paralytic, self-reproducing distance that blocks our capacity to fully recognize each other. But like Martin Buber, who sought to capture the aspiration to unmediated relational encounter in his famous book, I and Thou, I have thus far presented the desire for mutual recognition in a way that might suggest I am mainly speaking about a psycho-spiritual relation between two people. This then could give the impression that the world can be understood through the lens normally used by psychology as an infinite series of private encounters. But while I do mean to say that authentic mutual recognition can occur between two people, a couple falling in love, for example, or in an encounter between any two people who are able, by intention or accident, to break on through to the other side of the learned experiential boundary that has divided them, while I do mean to affirm that possibility, the fact is that the desire for mutual recognition and the fear of the other that opposes it undergirds the entire nexus of intersubjectivity that we call the social world. Thus, when transformative social movements emerge and break out, what actually takes place is a ricochet of recognition in which millions of people can sometimes become present to each other in a new way, and in which the sedimented layers of separation that had divided people into discrete, alienated social pockets are emulsified very quickly by the movement's rising force. In the late 1960s, for example, the fusion of the civil rights, women's, and anti-war movements, along with the generative creativity of the worldwide 60s counterculture, led to a ricochet of recognition that leaped like a flame from one city in the world to another very quickly, from Berkeley to Mexico City to Prague, and to countless other locations. The rising force that generated this experience of movement was actually the desire for authentic mutual recognition, gaining the social confidence to erupt across vast social spaces, creating a new social ground for millions of people to stand on, an unmediated, radiant ground of joyful co-presence. No matter what the roles and customs and identities that these masses of people had felt allegiance to and had been conditioned to be bound by prior to the movement's emergence, something in the air allowed people to leap forward toward each other and become present to each other on a new ground of being that transcended the particularities of their previous conditioning, at least temporarily. Much more than the hot moment of a movement's emergence is required to solidify a new ontological ground like this. And we will return to all this later in the book. But the point to be emphasized here in this first chapter is that the desire for mutual recognition is a social force that radiates throughout and across the social fabric of the world as a vector emerging as a force and a longing out from the center of each person as a pole of social being toward each other person. Insofar as the world precedes our birth and acculturates us to a conditioning by gender, race, nationality, economic status, and many, many other forms of conditioned particularity, that conditioning provides a vast, differentiated envelope of identity that we must conform ourselves to because it is the vehicle of recognition by which we become social at all. To take myself as an example, when I became conditioned in my childhood, I became all at once male, white, upper middle class, half Jewish, actually 3/4, a child of actors, American, somewhat tall, and was conditioned in countless other ways. All of these elements of my conditioning were transmitted to me through the way I was recognized by others. All of these elements were impossible to resist had I even wanted to, because they provided in significant part the channel to my actually being able to exist at all as a social person. And had something kept me from properly identifying with the way I was recognized, I would have become schizophrenic or died from failure to thrive. And at the same time, all of these elements of my conditioning linked me to the wider social world by virtue of who shared my identifications and who did not share them, by the cascade of interlocking, intersubjective recognition that actually constitutes the social world and brings it into being. The desire for mutual recognition both supports our social conditioning, since we must seek the recognition of our parents and other adults who are here to receive us if we are to realize our social nature, and transcends our social conditioning insofar as our conditioning is alienated, insofar as it does not actually make possible the realization of the fully present interhuman encounter. In our being, we seek the direct, unmediated co-presence to which Bergman's portrait aspires. This is the life force that moves the social world forward and also makes true Martin Luther King's statement that the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. But in our conditioning, we are bound by the conditions of how we are actually recognized from birth, with all its limitations, with the fear of the other that it transmits and contains. Yet because the longing for authentic mutual recognition always exerts a transcendental pressure on the limitations of our conditioning, we are only bound by our conditioning so long as the web of recognition that produced it remains stable, remains more or less the same from an ontological point of view. The possibility of going beyond those limitations and the constant unconscious search to go beyond them exists at all times and is our source of hope. Now, in order to more fully link this description with socio-historical interpretation and place these still seemingly psychological insights in relation to how we normally think about large-scale social processes, let me return to our description of the feudal lord of the Middle Ages. When Marxists or other socio-economic interpreters think of the feudal lord, they think of him in relation to his interests, as if he were a kind of cog in an external system of socio-economic relations. In this way of seeing, he might have had a psychological life, but it would have been understood as on the side, in the way that everyone has a psychological or spiritual life, shaped, for example, by his family and by life circumstances. But his real existence in a social and historical setting would be understood in terms of his interests within the functioning of the whole system, as a member of the ruling class, overseeing his landed estate, appropriating the labor of the serfs, and increasingly of wage workers, assuming we are again viewing him in the late feudal period of the 15th century, protecting those workers as an incident of fealty, and supporting and benefiting from the legitimacy of the monarchy and the church and the ideology that these prevailing political and religious institutions generated. What I am proposing is that we revise this entire way of seeing the feudal lord and recover his lived existence through apprehending him as a living being, desiring to fully recognize and be recognized by others, to be recognized by, for example, the person next to him, but with that desire also contradicted by the envelope of alienation and fear of the other that he by birth and social reproduction was thrown into. Thus his lordship as a totality of mannerisms, style, pretense, belief, condescension and deference, dehumanization of his vassals, both as factors of production of agricultural goods and as imaginary others occupying a lesser place in the feudal hierarchy. All of these and countless other ways of being a lord are shaped by and transcended by the conflict between desire and fear that actually incarnates him in relation to all others as a real existential living social being. Within this way of seeing the feudal lord, what drives the historical process forward is not his formal relationship to an external system, for Marxism, a division of classes pursuing their respective interests that are in contradiction under conditions of material scarcity, for example, but rather the transcendent longing for mutual recognition organizing itself through not entirely predictable socio-historical emergences, which sometimes have a class character, as in the overall struggle of the rising merchant and capitalist class to break asunder the restraining feudal relations, sometimes have an ideological character, as in the eventual coalescing of the Protestant revolts against the Catholic Church, and sometimes through cultural upsurges like the forms of dress, popular song, and poetry, and liberatory sexuality that give voice to each rising movement, which we can now understand as a movement of social being seeking its own realization through transcendent and authentic community. This is not to say that the material factors shaping the feudal lord's life are unimportant, but rather that they refer to those aspects of the lord's social existence that pertain to the survival of his body, and under conditions of scarcity provide an important channel for the longing of the desire for mutual recognition to express itself. When the peasants revolt, they are in fact starving, and they want to overthrow those who are depriving them of food. But if they lived in a beloved community, human beings would not turn each other driven by material need. Thus there is a coexisting mutual influence of material and social spiritual factors that must always be understood by linking the survival and health of the body with the full social realization of our relational collective being. I will address this further in chapter 6, but first we must fill out our description of the encounter of the desire for mutual recognition with the social envelope into which it is born and contained. How exactly does social desire that exists in everyone come to alienate itself in actual human relations? Okay, that's the end of chapter 1.